we had like the big gorgeous room down on the ground floor. Apparently not.
Oh
so.
no.
That would have been too big.
It would have
Too
been
expensive.
beautiful.
Yeah.
I decided not to do the carbon wrangler thing.
I kind of am disappointed that
Well, I should have checked with you.
you should
I
have.
could have gone back to my hotel and put on the regalia.
I even said when Stanley came in, I was like, first of all, I love that he calls himself a cowboy. He is the cowboy wrangler, and you wear cowboy shirts, and I was like, but I'm highly disappointed that it's not on full display today.
Well, I was going to represent the center. So I want the focus to be on our guests. I want the focus to be on the center, not on my shirt. So there was a part of me that was like, for webcasts, will it create a moire?
Yeah.
Another time.
You look great.
So, but definitely, like the dinner on April 10th, like you better believe.
Okay.
Like, I will
Oh,
totally.
you need to wear a tie, by the way. That face you have to wear a tie.
Is that with a bolo tie?
If it doesn't, they have a whole box of extra ties they'll make you wear.
Yeah, we can't put a tie on that. So
Well, choose carefully. No, so listen. Was it last year or the year before? Some guy came, every day in the invitation, like, this face retires a jacket and a tie, right? Some guy shows up with a jacket and a turtleneck.
Like,
They busted out the box of ties and they made him put on the tie. He was so pissed. Half of the place was like, you have to wear it.
these places, I've been to these places over the course of my career. You can't change it. You can't reason. It's just, it is in their charter.
You're not going to start a turtleneck
It's the
revolution.
Princeton Club, like, forget it. Like, you're just going to lose this one. And they are perfectly happy throwing you to the curb.
Yeah.
So. All right, so that means I can't wear it. Because if I got to wear a jacket, too. I gotta wear a jacket.
You don't have a jacket that's like bedazzled.
That's the right question to ask. I don't have a bedazzled jacket.
Okay, I know what I'm getting you for Christmas.
Well, so one of the guys who was there last night, James Kahn, the guy at Skyberry, he sent me a link to Western Wear, a place online that sells like high-end bolo ties. So I'm like totally there. Because until I commission it from a silversmith, like I need like a good working around, like I just like the belt buckle. Like, I need to see like. So.
It's not totally
Well,
fine.
it's
But
fancy
it's also
work.
worth
All
it.
right.
You're like, this is fun. If anyone wants to say. No, I can. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding.
That's all right. I'm not hurt.
Well, what's the cynics over you?
Sarah likes me.
You're like,
I'm pretty sure that's not true. But she doesn't.
Can I set you guys up with the mics just so we can check the levels while you have a lovely conversation?
No problem.
and we're coordinated.
Yeah, somebody forgot to send Julio the memo.
Yeah, well, Julio. Did you have a black shirt? Thank you.
I can put that on.
Is this your coat?
Yes, it is.
Go
Yeah, we
behind
were
the
just
podium.
talking about the fact that, like, I'm not wearing the Wrangler wear that
Oh, yeah.
I'm prone to wear.
Julia.
And I have a very fancy, yeah, exactly, so, but I want to be intentional. You guys all want to. So. Sweet. There you go. It's a little edgy. Yeah.
Sarah has to make sure that there's little something.
Hello, I'm Odin. Sí, Joaquín. Mira, te quería pedir si tienen un mic holder para los inalámbricos. El sostenedor de micrófonos, uno de los grandes.
I wish you had your glass.
Sí, lo que pasa es que solo van a usar 4 micrófonos, o sea que van a usar solamente los inalámbricos y no tengo 3 de los grandes y 2 de los pequeños, así que necesitaría uno más de los grandes. Podemos traer 2 por las dudas, así tenemos ese también. No, estoy contando ese, estoy contando ese. Sí. Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Is it question time suddenly find that I'm not even registered to be here. So
That's all right. We love you anyways.
that's what you think. So were you there when
Everything I have on nuclear is like a pod. It's the most patient person for all of my city questions. And Susie and I properly track
I made a movie called The Fire.
So you're that David Shore.
I am that David.
You know, Todd was a big fan of that, actually. So.
Wow,
Oh,
that's
well,
amazing.
of course, no. He occasionally, he showed it at a bunch of different breakthrough dialogues. And a special
He did?
screening of the new Fire, yeah.
That's amazing. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. No, I saw Todd in Ottawa, and he said he's starting at Michigan. He's going to run the nuclear program there, which is pretty amazing. And yeah, Todd's great. But is he still, so he's a name. You're
Julio.
Julio, nice to meet you.
Yeah, so actually I'm I believe I've got the title of something like Senior Fellow at the Breakthrough Institute.
Do you
So,
really?
yeah, so I've got, it's a 3-year appointment. It comes with no responsibilities. So Ted brought me on just a year ago, so.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
That's great. What do you work for something?
This
CCUS.
carbon stuff. Yeah, carbon bill.
Carbonville.
Yeah.
Did you the event? There was a Canadian embassy or consulate event last
Was
night.
that at the event? That was my event.
That was your event. So I registered for it, but I was too sick to make it.
Oh,
But-
well, not too sick for us.
yeah. Well, this is like getting paid.
Oh, okay.
No, I recovered last night.
Good.
No, so tell me how that, I wanted to go, because
Oh,
I know Phyllis.
standing room only. It was fantastic. And they have a fabulous space. Terrific. And it was full of food. The highlight for me was not just that we had the state of New York. precise or even accurate. So, so, right. Mhm. Right. But often, if it is straightforward, that's actually the sine qua non, right? Because if it's not straightforward to do the accounting, then nobody does the accounting, and you just end up in some silly place.
Well, it's gotta be real quick, real easy, cheap.
Mhm.
That's good enough.
So if you'll excuse me, sir. So Julie, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you. So I'm perfectly happy to go into all of these in full
No,
length.
just the highlights.
Thank you. That was the thing I wanted to know. I wasn't sure just how deep to go. And I'm happy to
Where's
sort
the
of.
script?
It's
Okay,
here.
there it is.
The script I know I have to actually get, yeah.
It's mainly just like the hashtag CGEP events.
Right. Do I have to say my name?
I think the crowd needs to know her name.
Well, if they either know my name or it's gonna create, room for Interpol to hunt me down. I mean, I don't know just how good that's gonna be. So,
You can choose not to sit here. Jump in. Start in like 10, 15 minutes.
yeah, exactly.
So one of the best things about doing this is I had people like John Larson and Elizabeth Sasser like
Mhm.
see the announcement and say, Sarah, let's talk. So it's been nice because they got some good
Nice.
chance to see what they're up to. It's good.
Excellent.
So the news got out about it, even if I can't see it always. It's there.
Are you?
So I was like, well, I wish I was there, but it's good.
Okay.
Sarah and I are staying at the same hotel room in town.
Okay, I've hired you once.
The Nat
It's not impossible to hire you again.
Lexington by
Keep that in mind.
something.
If it seems like that's of interest, let me know.
51st and
See what-
3rd.
Oh,
So,
yeah,
like
good.
probably like 6
Yeah.
months.
I'm not.
Yeah,
in
yeah,
New York,
perfect.
So we had a
I
bunch
don't
of
live in
the
New York
town
City. I
meetings,
still
so.
live in Liberty.
Yes.
So, such things are possible.
So you should come and meet them. Sarah was like, I didn't get drink here, but I was like, I have a ton of them. I don't really understand why, but I think we can use them.
I'm sure you are, actually. And my guess is you're doing better than other offices.
Yeah.
For the TA, mainly for the streaming.
Sure. Definitely. I'm just using this for my.
But they're not on, they're not on right now, are they?
Yeah, they aren't on.
Perhaps we
They're
can
not
chat about
recording
that
our
more.
gossip. Maybe you'll- so you
We
still
can
get
share
the-
one.
Exactly. I don't want to spend all of our time gossiping.
But we can share one
We
if
can.
you want.
Yeah, we can.
We can share a night, that's easy
Yeah.
enough.
We'll just give one of ours.
Yeah, you can have this one.
Fine.
Right.
So it's not until like the last.
Okay. Well, you can have it.
Good. You're the new, okay, that's good. Because Anne wasn't exactly pulling her weight. That's all right.
But I'm expected to.
So, Sally had mentioned something about that, and, not about, she had mentioned that you were gonna be in, North Charlotte, later this week, so, and I'm really glad I'm not, actually.
I'm
That-
not either, actually.
Oh, you're not?
I'm gonna be in DC, so I may see you again. On
Okay.
Friday.
On the 28th, or on the 29th? Yes, oh, good, you're
I'm
coming
on
to
Friday
the,
morning.
yes, I saw
So
that,
that's it.
with the Canadian Embassy. The Canadians again.
That's right. In the building that has no cell phone reception.
Yeah, that building is like a bunker, isn't it? It is. And every time you're in it, you're like, really? It's still like this?
But,
But they kind of like it that way.
I think
Isn't
it's
that obvious, you
intentional.
know?
Yeah, I think it's intentional.
No, I don't think it was intentional. I think it was accidental, but they're keeping it that way
Yeah.
intentional. Because it's not that hard to put a repeater station in, and they just were like, we don't need to do that.
Exactly.
Where's it going with this? Blah, 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 blah.
North Carolina, they're.
No, I was thinking about specifically the Canadian Embassy, and they have the best view in all of DC. That third floor, whatever, where the residence is, like, it is awesome.
I haven't ever been to the third floor. I've mostly been to the basement.
I've been to the basement many times, but I've been to 2 different receptions up on the top floor. There's this killer patio that looks out over the mall and the Capitol. It's just a stunning,
That's
stunning
nice.
view. So you guys know I'm going to cut you off at 5 minutes and 5 seconds, right? I'm going to have a little stopwatch here.
Why do you need that long?
I find that hard to believe.
I'll be quick.
You think you're quick until you write it out, and then you're like, oh,
Oh,
there's a
listen.
little bit more to say than I thought there was.
I know. Oh, listen, I was at Cornell in early November class, and she was like, oh, you can come lecture. And I was like, sure. So excited that I'm going to have like an hour and a half of stuff to say. An hour and 20 minutes until I was like, I'm in a hurry to finish all this stuff.
See?
I know.
Have that much to say.
So we were already getting tweets for this event. Where's Reuse Co? Reuse Co 2? Somebody just sent out a picture of us.
In our finery, in our matching outfits, which were not planned, not coordinated. But not unexpected, I suppose, right?
Yeah, little CO2 initiative. All right. Julie, do you want me to introduce you or not? Different, all right. So question for the three of you guys. Do you or do you not think that Jeopardy will continue after Alex Trebek dies? Definitely, you think it will?
It's still really popular, probably.
They're gonna
I
have
have
a
no
big
idea.
national contest
Not
to
thought about
replace it.
Watts is gonna take a big role
Ken
and bigger
Jennings will
roles.
just-
Yeah.
I mean,
He
it's
does a
gonna be.
podcast now, he'll take over, right?
No, I think that Sally's got it, and that harnessing that animus was fabulous. Where you basically said, like, why shouldn't you have a reality show whose job it is to select the next host for Jeopardy? Like, of course that makes
Borrow your
sense.
pen for 2 seconds.
Of course. I also have another pen.
No, it's okay. I just was like,
You
I'm just
sure?
reading through this and I'm
He
like,
doesn't need
oh,
a
there's
pen,
some.
we
No, it's all good.
I don't have one.
So at this point, I
Do you
think
want
we're
one?
limited by the speed of the elevator. Let's give it another.
Yeah, it's the slowest elevator.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
silly.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you need to get out?
Just grab it. Thank you, Erin. Yeah, of course.
I should have, but I didn't. So.
Well, I already hit my, steps
You know, you could just walk in from Queens. That would set you up for the day.
For life. It's all right. I thought you were going to be gone longer. I just would have continued standing.
Oh, I will take a first one.
No, I thought you were
So
headed to the
let me suggest that as hosts, we failed you right off the bat because we don't have water here for the panel. So
It's
that's
okay.
that was a design problem. So apologies.
I have a water bottle. I just didn't bring it.
Okay.
I have too many stickers on it.
I should
We have carbon 180 water bottles. I need to start bringing them around. I know they're really good ones too. They're like the
I want one.
insulated.
I
I
that you have swag.
know.
I think you should send us one
Okay.
each.
We.
Are you allowed to accept it?
Oh yeah. What's the gift on it?
Personally?
Say personally. No. I don't know how much this costs. Well, we're
Send
getting.
me two, and then I'll be like, Sarah, can you just take this off my
So we're
hand?
just. We'll just.
Great.
I'll just drop
Sarah,
it near
I
you
need
somewhere.
I need you to.
These aren't on, right? Well, what is definitely under $10 is we are trying to do. I'm trying to convince Noah that we should get Carbon 180 temporary tattoos. So, why would you not?
How about carbon 180 knitting needle bracelets? Could you?
Wait, have we not talked about knitting before? I'm
Uh-oh.
obsessed with knitting. I've been knitting. I'll show you my socks I'm working on. Someone recent. Oh, Noah's wife, I think, kind of laughed at me and thought I was joking. We were talking about our house is being broken into, and I was like, the most expensive thing I own is yarn and knitting needles. Like I have the Addy clicks. I'm like, those Addy clicks are like more expensive than basically anything besides my laptop that I own. And I definitely have at least like $1,000 worth of yarn in my house. And she was like, how? And I'm like, yarn is expensive. You have no idea. And also, I have too much of it.
You can't like help but buy more, right? Yeah.
I have a nephew. As soon as he was born, before he was born, I was giving my mom such a hard time because she'd send me, it's the first grandkid, these pictures of her buying all these clothes for him. I'm like, Mom, you need to calm down. And then I got to the yarn store and I was checking out. I'm like, I just bought $400 worth of yarn for this baby. And that was not the only trip I made for him. I'm like,
But I love making baby stuff because it's so small and it's so fast.
it's so cute. I swear, I think I'm a really overly involved aunt. But that
Start with Sally at the end and work this way.
Oh,
Sure. Are you ready?
I was kind of hoping to go last. No, I'm kidding. It's fine.
If someone wants to
No,
go
no, it's
first.
totally fine. I'm joking.
We haven't coordinated on what we're talking about, but I assume we're talking about different things.
It'll be okay.
Not contradictory.
No.
If you're contradictory, I'll make something of it.
Yeah.
That's true. I'd be surprised.
I would be
I'm talking a lot
really
about
surprised.
the
I think
Green
we all
New Deal,
have
which I
different
assume you will talk
perspectives.
to, right?
Sure, I'm gonna talk about that.
Excellent.
It's not approved. 602.
You guys set?
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know how to turn these on though.
Oh, I think you're on.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Julio Friedman. I'm a senior research scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy and the director of the Camry Initiative, the Carbon Management Research. Tonight's event, which is being co-hosted by the Center for Global Energy Policy's Women in Energy program, is the first public event for this initiative. So thank you all for being here. The Carbon Management Research Initiative explores public policy, financial and economic aspects of removing, storing, and using carbon dioxide. Tonight we are incredibly blessed and fortunate to have the august and awesome panel that we have here tonight. We're talking about CCUS, carbon capture, use, and storage as a tool to counter climate change with this incredible team of experts. Let me quickly say that this event, like all those at the center, is being webcast live, and the full video will be available on our website in the coming days. And for those of you who are watching online, as well as people here in the audience, you can ask a question of the panelists at any time using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy, all one word. So with that, let me take a moment and introduce the event and our panelists. Over the past couple of years, we've had a set of dislocations around our climate change discussion. 3 years ago, I think it was fair to say that a whole bunch of us were quite optimistic with the passage and approval of the Paris Accord, with what seemed to be this remarkable progress we were making on the costs of renewables, the technology improvements on things like batteries, and there was this, I think, sense of optimism and this sense of progress that was palpable and that a lot of people liked. I think that was true in our community in Carbonville as well. Fast forward to 3 years, I don't think everyone's got that same sense of optimism. It seems that for 3 years now, emissions have risen worldwide. They've risen in places like Germany, a leader in renewables, and California, a leader in renewables. In all these places, we're seeing more emissions growing. I think the progress that people saw in China and we're really hoping was going to pan out worldwide has been tempered by their increased heavy industry and the technologies that have gone with it, like coal to olefins and other kinds of things. In addition to that, we've seen a set of political dislocations that not everybody anticipated, whether it's Brexit or in Russia with Vladimir Putin, or Xi Jinping's specific response to create Xi Jinping thought as part of the Communist Party platform to our own country here. We are seeing sort of radical changes that have shaken up the whole gumball machine in this context. In part for that reason, and in part because people like the people up here on our panel have been working so carefully, so diligently, so well, and so long, we are seeing a moment now for carbon management in the form of carbon capture, use, and storage. In part, it's being prompted by the fact that these technologies have matured quite a lot over the past decade. Costs have dropped, performance has improved, and we've got places around the world that are doing it now. At the same time, policies have begun to come forward that have created markets for this technology that didn't exist a couple of years ago. In addition to that, things like the IPCC report, the 1.5 degree report, have pressed on the urgency associated with more ambitious climate action. And in that context, additionality, greater effort is required, and in that context, carbon capture and storage has grown as a topic of interest. This is a topic which is very near and dear to my heart, but I would be remiss if I talked about it anymore and instead turned it over to the incredible team of experts that we have on this panel. Let me start by introducing all three of these incredible women who I've known for a very long time and who have done so much already in this field over the course of their careers. Let me start with the incomparable Dr. Sally Greenberg. She's the Associate Director of Energy and Materials at the Illinois State Geological Survey, and she is the Principal Investigator for the Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium, one of the U.S. Department of Energy's 7 regional partnerships. And she's also founder of the Sequestration Training and Education Program, STEP. Among other things, Dr. Greenberg is an expert not just at the geoscience of storing CO2 underground, but she has personally helped field one of the best and biggest projects anywhere in the world, which is the Archer Daniel Midland Storage Project in Decatur, Illinois. In addition to that, she is an incredible expert, deep, knowledgeable, capable actor in terms of outreach between the communities of people who do carbon capture and storage and the communities that they actually affect, whether it is the local communities, whether it is around questions of safety or environmental justice or finance. Sally is a go-to person around the world on these topics. Next to her sits the incredible Erin Burns. She's the Associate Director of Policy at Carbon 180, which is a climate-focused NGO dealing exclusively with CO2 removal. There she works with scientists, entrepreneurs, academics, and policymakers to create and inform federal policy on carbon capture, carbon removal, and carbon use. Previously, she worked in the Senate, where she handled energy, environment, labor, and agricultural issues, including staffing the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and the Public Lands Subcommittee. She's a native of southern West Virginia. Throughout her career, she's worked on issues including things like coal worker and coal community transition and how these kinds of jobs and programs affect communities. She holds a degree in cultural anthropology from Carnegie Mellon University. Last but by no means least, sitting next to me is Ms. Sarah Forbes, who is a scientist at the U.S. Department of Energy. I had the very good fortune of working with Sarah closely when we were both there, but we've worked together for almost 18 years on this topic. First when she was at National Energy Technology Lab, and then after that when she was at the World Resource Institute. She applies her ecological perspective to questions of regulation, policy, and engineering challenges, including carbon capture and storage, not just in that context, but also in the context of other clean energy technologies. She leads the strategic planning process for the Office of Clean Coal and Carbon Management and oversees a select set of policy and economic activity analyses. Among other things that we worked on together, one of the proudest moments of my career was working with Sarah at the World Resource Institute on the guidelines, the CCS guidelines for carbon capture, transport, and storage, which we created to be a user's document for people who wanted to actually field and operate these things. We said, what do they care about? What do we do? And Sarah was unquestionably the instrumental leader for that whole effort and for the creation of the guidelines. So we owe you thanks for that. With that, I'd like to take just a moment, again, for those of you who are out in the audience. I just want to say again, for you watching online, my name is Julio Friedman. I'm here with Erin Burns, the Associate Director for Policy for Carbon 180, Dr. Sally Greenberg, the Associate Director of Energy and Minerals at the Illinois State Geological Survey, and Sarah Forbes, Scientist at the Office of Fossil Energy and the U.S. Department of Energy. We are discussing carbon capture, use, and storage as a tool to counter climate change. And we will have first a conversation among the panelists, and then we're going to open up for questions to the audience in a bit. Again, for those of you here in person, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring you a mic, and we'll take your questions. For those of you who are watching online, you can use hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy to ask questions. I will insist that you ask questions. This is not a place for testimonials. This is a place for discourse and exchange. So with that, let me start with Dr. Greenberg.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank the Center on Global Energy Policy, Women in Energy, and the Carbon Management Research Initiative for hosting this event. It's a great pleasure for me to be on this panel with these two amazing women who both have deep experience in the energy space, and I look forward to the discussion that we have and with engaging all of you. We've been asked to keep our comments brief, so I will do my best to honor that. And in that spirit, let me tell you just a little bit about myself and the perspective that I bring to carbon capture, utilization, and storage. As you heard from my bio, I'm a researcher at the Illinois State Geological Survey, which is at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And my organization has been working in the area of carbon storage and in carbon capture for more than 20 years. I personally have been working in this space since 2003 and have had the pleasure of working with both Sarah and Julio for that entire time. And the experiences and viewpoints that I share with you tonight really are based in practical project experiences, derived from many years of research and boots on the ground opportunities to put into place deployment of carbon capture or carbon capture and storage. The main idea that I want you to walk away from this exchange with, and what I would like to stress, is that carbon storage has been demonstrated. We know it to be safe, and we know how to do it when we are ready to do so. And but we'll get to that a little bit later in the discussion. Currently, as Julio mentioned, I'm the principal investigator for the Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium, which is one of 7 regional partnerships established in 2003 by the U.S. Department of Energy to explore the potential for carbon storage across the United States and to assess our carbon storage capacity throughout the country. The partnership that I lead focuses on a single geologic feature, the Illinois Basin, which is an underlying rock formation that underlies the states of Illinois, Indiana, and parts of Kentucky. We have exceptional rocks, and as a geologist, I feel quite qualified to say that. And what my team set out to do through our partnership is to demonstrate just how good the rocks in the Illinois Basin are for carbon storage. Through a series of steps, systematically, the regional partnerships assessed the regional capacity for carbon storage. We conducted small pilot studies, and then ultimately, in and around 2007, 2008, engaged in designing large-scale demonstration projects. So the Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium is the lead on a project called the Illinois Basin Decatur Project, which was designed to store 1 million tons of carbon dioxide from ethanol production. So it's a biofuels carbon capture and storage project. And we are storing carbon dioxide more than 6,800 feet beneath the surface in Decatur, Illinois, in a sandstone unit with CO2 captured from Archer Daniels Midland ethanol production. I'm just about done with my comments, but I want to point out that the project that I lead and have been a participant in is special for several reasons, but I will highlight 3 of those. So we were one of the first demonstrations in a non-fossil fuel-based carbon storage scenario. We're also the first project to demonstrate the full concept of bioenergy, CCS or BECCS, where capturing CO2 from ethanol production allows us to essentially store twice the amount of carbon, considering that corn in the process of growing uses carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in photosynthesis. We capture that carbon dioxide from the ethanol fermentation process and store it in sandstone layers deep beneath the earth. And lastly, this project has faced and met the challenge of commercial upscale, which is a very key part of carbon storage deployment in this day and age. And we took our research project funded by the Department of Energy and leveraged that into an industrial scale project led by Archer Daniels Midland. So we went from storing 333,000 tons of CO2 per year to 1 million tons per year. And so we were able to do that by having significant amount of geologic characterization and learning a lot in the first project, which we could leverage for the second project. So there are a lot more technical details I would love to share with you, but we are limited in time. So let me close by saying that what has been accomplished in Illinois was possible by working together in both public and private industrial partnerships. We've worked diligently for more than 15 years to demonstrate this technology so that I can sit before you tonight and say that we are ready to safely store, monitor, and account for carbon dioxide in the subsurface.
Outstanding. Thank you so much. There's another distinctive aspect of your project which I will come back to, but now I'm going to instead turn it over to Erin.
Great. Thank you for having me here today. So as Julio mentioned, I'm the Associate Director of Policy at Carbon 180. So for a little bit of background of Carbon 180, we are a California-based climate NGO focused on carbon capture and removal, and we have a mission of getting to an economy where we remove more carbon than we emit. And I'm here to talk about two things. So as Julio mentioned, I came out of the Senate. I'm not the kind of technical on the ground expert. I work in federal policy. So I want to talk about two things. The first is where we are today on carbon capture and removal policy at the federal level. And the second is what kind of opportunities we have in the near to midterm future on these things. So there are kind of three big policies that are out there around carbon capture and removal, three big kind of buckets I want to talk about. The first is the 45Q tax credit. So this is a tax credit that's been around for a while, but about a year ago, Congress passed a bill and was enacted into law to update this tax credit. And it's a really big deal. It provides a per ton value on CO2 for carbon capture projects, but it also provides value for, it makes sure that direct air capture projects for the first time are eligible for this. And it makes carbon use, CarbonTech is what we call turning CO2 into commercial products. We use the term CarbonTech, so that's what I'll say. It makes sure that CarbonTech is eligible for this credit as well. The other thing that I want to talk about, the second thing, is efforts to change how the Department of Energy works. So Julio mentioned, and I'm sure Sarah will talk about all of the fantastic work that the Department of Energy has done on carbon capture. But a lot of that has been done under the coal program, and a lot of it has historically been focused on coal. And there are efforts in both the House and the Senate right now to update how the Department of Energy, and specifically the Office of Fossil Energy, which is where most of the vast majority of this work happens on carbon capture, to update how it works. So this hasn't happened. They I think updated it last in 2007, 2005.
2007
so
was
it's
the
been a while.
amendment,
Yeah. So it's kind of due for an update. And we're really excited about these bills. Some of the things they might do are start a dedicated carbon removal program. So Julio mentioned that's a big focus of ours, but there's not a lot of federal funding for that right now. I think to date, we've calculated there's about $9 million in the history of the entire Department of Energy that's gone towards direct air capture. And so some of the bills would start to have a dedicated carbon removal program that's closer to the scale that we need. It would also start to look at things like industrial capture, have more funding. One of the things Julio had mentioned recently was we've seen a little bit of an increase in the funding that DOE puts towards CarbonTech. We need a lot more money. Those bills would start to move in the right direction. And then there's a third bill, which is called the Use It Act, which would provide about $85 million total in funding and R&D funding for carbon use, for direct air capture, and it starts to look at, I think, and the second title is one of the things that I think is most interesting because it starts to look at carbon capture from this, I think historically at the federal policy level, we've kind of thought about it as a project by project issue sometimes, at least in Congress, where we're going to deploy one big project or 5 big projects, and you're going to learn a lot by kind of getting that experience on the ground. You're going to bring down the cost, and then you're going to see a bunch of carbon capture deployed. And that's definitely a really important part of it. But there's also a role for the federal government in figuring out what are the kinds of pieces of infrastructure that we need across state lines, federally, to make sure we can get to the level of deployment of carbon capture and carbon removal that we need to see to have impact on emissions. But I will say overall, I think, Julio was talking about kind of the state of climate and whether people felt optimistic about it. I think there is a bit of optimism in DC, and I think there's a ton of interest in carbon capture and removal, but I think we're at a bit of an inflection point for these technologies, and I think we're at an inflection point for climate policy more broadly, and I think that's been pretty obvious maybe to the general public, I think, on the climate piece. So we've seen conservative members in Congress who've historically kind of questioned whether or not climate is something that we should be focusing on, whether that's, questioning climate science or saying maybe it's happening, maybe it's not, but we shouldn't be spending federal resources on it, to coming out and saying this is a really important issue. We've seen hearings that have been a lot more productive than they have in the past. Senator Barrasso, the Republican from Wyoming, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times at the end of last year saying we need to do a lot on climate. This is a real problem. We take it seriously. And of course, we've seen things like the Green New Deal. And I think that in particular has made an enormous impact in DC. And I think one of the important things about it is that it's reframed the question of how do we address climate at the federal level. And I think it's made people think about this not just as a kind of, punitive, climate policy is going to be this punitive carbon tax frame, which we don't have a position. Carbon tax is fine. We should not anything bad about it. But as this opportunity, as to kind of rethink how our economy works and to provide a better living for a lot of people, right? So there are things about unions and, transition for extraction communities and all of those sorts of things. And when the Green New Deal came out, there was a conversation amongst carbon capture advocates as well as some other folks like nuclear advocates on whether or not carbon capture and carbon removal were a piece of the Green New Deal. And they've affirmed, Ocasio-Cortez and Markey have publicly affirmed that those are definitely within the scope of the Green New Deal. But I think at Carbon 180, we never really questioned whether it was part of the Green New Deal. And I think a big reason for that was because this is kind of the thing we do, that reframing of climate action as an enormous opportunity is kind of how we've always viewed carbon capture and carbon removal. I think especially looking at the history of carbon capture, we've always worked with unions to find, the steelworkers and the United Mine Workers and the utility workers to figure out how can we provide a path for unions that pay, really good wages, living wages. How do we find a future for them in this kind of climate-constrained world? How do we provide a path for just transition for extraction communities? And I think especially as we look at new opportunities from technologies in carbon tech, where we did my colleagues Matt and Rory did a market sizing report and showed that there's a 1 trillion total available market in the US for these carbon tech products, that we've really seen that carbon capture and carbon removal can provide an opportunity to create a new kind of future that isn't about some sort of punitive climate action, but this is enormous opportunity to create a better, a kind of climate-friendly world, but that is better for people, right? That's good for workers, good for communities. And I think, and I'll stop here because I look forward to talking about this. But I think that the question now is just how we as carbon capture and carbon removal, carbon use advocates, how we figure out that level of ambition, because I think the question where we were all kind of asking, is this included in the Green New Deal? How does this affect us? I think we have a tendency sometimes to step back and say, why don't you include us? Can't you include us? This is really important. And we tell you all the facts and all the climate math and show you why this is really important. But I think what we need to do now is work with those folks and with others, work with the same folks we have in those communities and at the unions to show the people who are putting together these kind of bigger climate plans how carbon capture and carbon removal can be a piece of that.
Excellent. With that, certainly in no way, shape, or form least, Sarah, what have you got?
All right. So what I'm going to do in my brief remarks is talk a little bit about where CCS is from a technological perspective, what research we're doing at the Department of Energy. And I'm also going to talk about the remaining hurdles from a technical, policy, and financial perspective. So Julio and Sally, everybody's made reference to the fact that there's a lot of progress that's been made on CCS and that we've been working on it for a long time. And the Department of Energy has an active R&D program with goals right now that are focused on reducing the costs and risks to enable widespread deployment of carbon capture and storage. So the major remaining technical challenge is the cost of capture. And the goal that we have at the department is to reduce that cost by about 50%. It's a difficult goal to reach, but we think we can do it. And we've seen progress. We're investing in early stage research and development on advanced technologies, including solvents, sorbents, and membranes that can get us there. We've seen through time, and we have examples of technologies that have started in the lab and are now testing at large scale pilots. So we're seeing these capture technologies march through the technical development pathway. So if you look at CCS and the cost of CCS overall, about 75% of the cost is on the capture side. And there's about 10% in compression. The balance of the cost is your storage, your monitoring, and your pipelines. So getting that cost of capture down is a clear priority for the research right now. But there's also active research in carbon storage, and Sally referred to that a little bit. In carbon storage, our goal is to better see the subsurface so that we can improve the selection of sites for geological storage, so that we can improve the mechanism for both CO2 storage and utilization, and so that we can increase the certainty of secure containment and environmental protection. Now, one of the things that we've referred to a little bit in this panel, but we haven't talked about in detail, is in terms of CO2 utilization, we can use it to make products, and we can also use it to enhance oil recovery. And so the 45Q tax credit that Aaron mentioned has different levels for geological storage and for enhanced oil recovery. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. But first, we do have CCS projects in the United States, including the one that Sally mentioned. And these projects that we have up until now have been largely the result of public-private partnerships. So in a public-private partnership, that investment from the private sector is really important. And then there's government funding that pairs with that for the related research and development. So the public-private partnerships include the effort at Decatur, and there's an air products project that's capturing CO2 from a steam methane reformer in Texas, and a Petronova project that's capturing CO2 from a coal-fired power plant, also in Texas. These projects and the learnings that we're getting from these projects are really important to the future of CCS. But when it comes to commercial deployment, incentives and continued support is required. So one of the things that we do at the department is we do analysis, and we've done some analysis using the National Energy Modeling System, or NEMS. And doing that analysis, it shows that existing regulatory frameworks and tax incentives are insufficient for wide-scale deployment of CCS. The one thing that sometimes, we will talk about federal policy on the panel, but one thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned in my opening remarks is that state governments in the U.S. are also taking action on their own, and those actions that states are taking make a big difference. There are many states right now where your carbon capture equipment is tax exempt, States are also looking at other things, and they've adopted offtake agreements, utility cost recovery mechanisms, and CCS is eligible for electricity generation portfolio standards. So I'd like to just break it down a little bit before we get into questions. From a technical perspective, we know how to do CCS, but we need to get the costs down. And we need, to bring our brightest scientists and best research projects to the table to make that happen. We've done a lot at the department through our research and development on capture, also through the regional carbon sequestration partnerships. We have a major demonstration program. The projects that I mentioned are part of that. And we have a program called Carbon Safe that are proving the opportunity and the availability of CCS in resolving technical challenges. On the policy side, the existing incentives are insufficient, but they're a big deal and they're generating a lot of interest, which we've heard from the other panelists. On the financial side, each and every project, getting the financing, getting it to happen is a big lift. I wanted to mention in the opening remarks that there are existing government programs to support financing. This includes the Department of Energy's Loan Guarantee Program. The USDA also has a grant program through the Rural Development Authority. And there may be other options for other types of tax credits. But one of the things that's important is to think about the financing of a project. There's upfront financing that's needed, so something like the Loan Guarantee Program or a credit like the 48A credit, which was available for an investment tax credit for clean coal. That can help with the upfront financing costs. And policies like 45Q that provide a tax credit on $1 per ton of CO2 that's stored or used, that helps on the downside. And you really need both and probably more. And with that, I'm sure there's a lot more that we all have to say, but I'll make sure we reserve time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you guys so much. The way that we're going to take it from here, just so you all know, is for the next half hour or so, we're going to have a discussion here that's moderated in the panel. And then after that, around 7 o'clock or so, we're going to open up for questions. So I will ask you to just be patient. We'll get to you. We really want to hear your questions. We really want to have a dialogue. But let's start, if we can, with a dialogue just here. Based on your comments, let me first go to each of you and ask a sort of a specific or targeted thing. And again, starting with Sally, one of the things I mentioned is that you have something else special about the project in Decatur, Illinois, which is the first ever permitting for Class 6 wells. So the EPA created a whole well class just for the CO2 injection and storage. This well class has existed for almost 10 years now, and you guys were the first people to put it into place. Will you talk a bit about regulation associated with CCS?
Sure. I should have expected that. And actually, we not only had the first, but we had the second. So we have 2 Class 6 permits, one for the first project, which is the project that I lead, and the second Class 6 permit is for the Illinois Industrial Sources CCS project, which is part of the major demonstrations program, as Sarah mentioned. And so, being first is interesting. And you're the entity that a lot of the bugs get worked out on. And I will say that the permit process was long and took about 4 years for each of the permits to be, for the permit application process to go forward and for those permits to be issued. And and that can be a significant deterrent when planning projects if you cannot, if you can't judge how long it's going to take to get a permit. And as I mentioned, we were the first, so there was likely a lot of precedent setting that was taking place during the issuance of our permits. For my project, the downside of the delay or the length of time that it took was that by the time that our permit was issued, we had actually stopped injecting. So our permit is only for what's called the post-injection site care or the post-injection monitoring period. But what made the process even a bit more complicated was because there are two projects with injection wells that are a mile apart, so they're in close proximity of each other. The Environmental Protection Agency wanted the infrastructure from my project to support the infrastructure for the second project. And so through that process, those two projects got linked because they needed to have additional wells in place to monitor the CO2 injection for the larger project, which then, good or bad, extended my project another 3 years into a space where we were really not supposed to be, we should have been finished at the end of last year. So it gives us an opportunity to do more science and that sort of thing. But I guess the short story here is, or the takeaway is that that permitting continues to be a bit of a challenge in the CCS space, especially when you're looking at permitting for saline storage, so non-oil and gas associated, because of the Class 6 and not the Class 2 permit.
So just two quick answers on this. One, how long did it take you to get the first well permitted?
So we started with a state of Illinois Class 1 permit, which that process started in 2007, and we got permission to inject in 2011. And then it took from 2010, when Class 6 was put in place, until 2017 to get the Class 6 permit.
Right. So somewhere between 4 and 7 years.
Yes.
Right. And cost estimate for that?
So this is a really difficult question to answer, because in a research program, you don't stop doing research because you're waiting for your permit. So we leveraged the opportunity to get 7 years worth of pre-injection monitoring done and an extensive amount of geologic characterization, and we were not idle by any stretch of the imagination. So it's really hard for me to say how much it cost, because people associated with the permitting process were, engaged doing other things. I think what it really cost us, if you want to think about this extra permit period that we've got, that's about $5 million. And just the delays associated with, and the uncertainty of whether or not you're going to be able to move forward with a project, are what really made it a challenge. But it's very hard for me to put a dollar amount on it. I'll say one last thing. So somewhat naively, we thought when we started this project that the rate limiting step would be the capture and compression dehydration facility, which had a lead time of 52 weeks on the compressors when we ordered them. So we had those in place 2 years before we ever got to the point of injecting CO2.
Right. Thank you. Aaron, we've got these new policies in place. We're all very excited about that. When they came out, a lot of people were like, where did that come from? And they didn't necessarily understand the coalition building, the amount of time that had been working. Will you talk a little bit about the process, about how you create these policies and what's required to get them over the hump?
Sure. So, I spoke about 45Q for about 30 seconds. That's nearly a decade of work from people who have really spent their careers working on this. So I think we saw in a lot of places, one of the Obama budgets, I can't remember the exact year, maybe 2014, 2015, had the IRS budget had an early version of this 45Q tax credit.
2016.
Was it 2016? Okay, so not that reasonable. Well, it came out, it would have been it came out in 2015, or did it come out in 2016?
It was a 2016 budget.
Okay. And so to get these bills across the finish line, you need a lot of people caring about this a whole lot. So there's something called the Carbon Capture Coalition, of which we are a member, but it's a set of about 50 environmental NGOs, coal companies, labor unions, industrial partners,
There's an oil company. There's a whole bunch of folks. The National Farmers Union is now a member, and it's taken those kind of 50 organizations, and it's kind of fluctuated who's in there and who's not over the past 7 or so years, about 7 years to get this bill enacted. And when it was first introduced, I think just a bit of history, when it was first introduced, or was going to be introduced, it was called the Future Act. And we were worried there was actually going to be the only Democrats were going to be on this bill, because historically carbon capture and removal is something that primarily Democrats, and specifically coal state Democrats like Senator Rockefeller from my state of West Virginia, had been really avid supporters of. But these coal companies and oil companies and some of those partners who had better relationships with Republicans spent a lot of time going in and talking about all of the benefits beyond just climate that they saw with these technologies. And by the time it was introduced, it was a very bipartisan bill. At one point, we had Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who's pretty well known for giving a climate speech every single week on the Senate floor for a few years now at least. Senator McConnell was also a co-sponsor, and so you had this really, really broad set of people who had finally recognized the kind of importance of this. But to get to that point, that involved people. There was, Senator Whitehouse went on 2 different trips to see kind of the opportunities around carbon capture. He and Senator Graham went to Boundary Dam together. It was all of these enormous efforts to bring people in and to show them that this is, this is a really kind of bipartisan or nonpartisan issue where you can like carbon capture and removal and use for a whole bunch of reasons, right? You can like it for the reasons that a lot of us do, which is you need it to meet climate goals, but you can like it because there's an enormous economic value, that if you're a labor union, it provides a kind of future for you. And so to get any of these bills enacted takes kind of, it doesn't happen, you might see the bills introduced and 6 months, a few months from there it gets a hearing, and a few months later you kind of see it pass as part of a package. People don't really do floor votes on these things anymore. It gets kind of inserted in a package and it passes, and you kind of see this really seamless process. But it does take years for anything significant like these policies to happen. It typically takes years and lots of people arguing and spending late nights talking to members and getting all this stuff together.
Awesome, thank you. So Sarah, as much as I would love to talk to you about politics and policies, because we got a lot to say about that, I'm going to ask you about something else, which is you work in the coal program, and a lot of people see CCS as a coal technology. But we've got an ethanol plant over here, we've got hydrogen plants over there. Will you talk about the potential applications, not just on coal, but across the power sector and across the industrial sector, and how that informs what you do at DOE? Sure.
So, because of where the research program lies in the budget process, in many ways, and also because of the amount of CO2 at the time that we started, the program started, the amount of CO2 that was coming from coal-fired power plants, there was a wedding of carbon capture and storage to a vision of capturing CO2 from a coal-fired power plant. In many ways, that is something that is important. It's still an important part of our program. But the same technologies for capturing CO2 in many cases can be applied to a natural gas-fired power plant, and they can be applied to industrial sources of CO2. As early as I think 2007 or 2008, Pacific Northwest National Lab was putting out some really great analyses that showed, over time how wide-scale deployment of CCS might happen. And so one of the things that those early studies showed, I think correctly, was that if you can capture CO2 from what we sometimes call high-purity vent sources like ethanol, fertilizer, the steam methane reformers in the one project that I gave as an example, that the cost is lower and those are early opportunities for deployment. One of the things that's happened with the enactment of the Bipartisan Budget Act and the expanded 45Q program is that in parts of the country we're seeing a lot of interest from ethanol producers thinking about working together. States and regions are thinking about what are our sources and how could we use them to form a network. So coal remains, capture from coal-fired power plants remains an important part of our program, but it's not the only opportunity for CCS.
So let me ask a couple of questions for the panel as a whole. We got maybe 15 more minutes here before we open it up. So let's try to jam through a whole bunch of stuff as auspiciously and as beautifully as we can. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is sort of this question of public acceptance. That most people know what a solar panel is, they know what a windmill is, they know what a gas plant is, they know what a nuclear plant is. When we generally talk about this, most people don't know what we're talking about, and so they have questions, uncertainties, and risks. Can you guys talk about your experience in reaching out to the public so that they understand what we're talking about and how it benefits them?
So I'll start, and I'll leave the extensive comments to my colleagues who are social scientists on the panel. But I will say that the Department of Energy has recognized the importance of stakeholder engagement and education, and it's been an important part of the DOE program through the regional carbon sequestration program since at least 2003. One of the other things is, when we think about public acceptance, one of the things that we did during my time at the World Resources Institute is we published a set of guidelines for engaging communities in community engagement specific to CCS. There are a number of interesting things, and we can talk about that more, but really one of the things at the core of stakeholder engagement is discussing the risks and the benefits of a project with the local community.
Yeah, I think there are kind of two things when we think that kind of immediately come to mind. One is, I think one of the challenges people have around carbon capture is this is going to prolong the use of fossil fuels, right? And all the implications that come with that. Even if we strip the emissions, I'm from southern West Virginia. You're still might be mining coal, and that has impacts on human health and the environment. I think one of the things that we talk about there is we actually talk about the applications in the industrial sector. We talk about carbon removal. We talk about the fact that you can't really get rid of the industrial sector is 1/5 of U.S. emissions, and you can't zero those out without carbon capture. I think the other thing longer term, and I actually have notes scribbled to talk to Buck Sally with a bunch of questions about this, that's a little bit different than something like solar panels or wind turbines, is the question of carbon storage. I think we have a lot of questions, even people who work in this field. I was in an event recently, and that came up even with people who kind of work on this. So there are questions that we weren't sure of the answers for. I think that there is a big, there's going to need to be a much bigger, more thoughtful community engagement effort, and I think it's really important for the long-term success of this in places where we are injecting CO2 who people do understand it, right? Because people, understandably, you don't know what's going on, and somebody's putting a bunch of stuff under the ground where you live, and even though we know it's safe and then we understand it really well, and Sally's worked on it for a really long time, if you don't do a good job of communicating that to the people on the ground who aren't technical experts, have a lot of other things to worry about, who don't spend all of their time thinking about this, then I think that's going to be a big challenge for us. And I think that's something that we're still, at the federal policy level at least, I think people are definitely still grappling with.
So I want you to know that I could literally talk about this subject for a week. But I won't. I want you to, first of all, to know that Sarah was incredibly understated in her comments about the impact of the World Resources Institute Community Stakeholder Engagement Guidelines, which really set the stage for significant understanding in that space and serve as a really great guidebook on how to engage communities. I have been thinking about this, the concept of stakeholder engagement and communicating with the public for a very long time. In fact, the first time that Sarah and I met was on this subject way back when. And thinking about how we communicate science and technology, why we communicate, how we do it well, and how we listen and engage. So stakeholder engagement is a two-way process that needs to involve many, many people, and there needs to be a dialogue. So it's not a one-way information exchange where I tell you everything I know about carbon storage and you walk away happy and assured that everything will be fine. that said, you know, much of what we have done in the engagement space over the last 10 or 15 years has really been at the project level. So we've been, those of us in the technology have been very focused on demonstrating that carbon capture and storage works, and we have been funded by the Department of Energy to do that. And so in that space, engagement has to happen around projects. And so that can be, we have examples of where that's been successful and examples of where that has not been successful. And one of the things that I learned through the WRI engagement process and was fortunate enough to be part of that expert consultation process was, you know, you can have the best stakeholder engagement in the world, but it does not guarantee project success. And so that's something that you all, but you have to do it. You have to do it no matter what. I'll finish up by saying that, as Aaron mentioned, we're at an inflection point in the space of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and we've seen a lot of renewed energy, no pun intended, around because of 45Q. I get calls in my office almost every week or so from ethanol companies or industrial sources who are interested to find out whether or not it's a viable technology for them. So what I think is going to happen in the engagement space is that we're going to move away from only this project level engagement to more of the policy level that Aaron has been talking about, which we have definitely seen and is coming to fruition after 10 long years of trying to get policy in place. But there's need for more policy, as Sarah said. And then what needs to happen is we need to get into the public, into the general public space. But until you really have something to talk about and there's some momentum behind it, it's very difficult to have that conversation with the general public about what is carbon capture and storage and why do we need it, because there's not enough to really talk about.
Sure.
So one thing I'd like to add, just tying together Aaron and Sally's and I guess my points is, you know, we've mentioned the fact that we have a regulatory framework for CCS in place, and we've talked about the costs, but that also ties into this idea of the public and how does the public feel about CCS. You know, the U.S. has, we have Class 6 geological sequestration rules which were put in place in 2009, and those were designed to enable CCS and at the same time make sure that we're protecting underground sources of drinking water.
So let me pivot off of that conversation and talk a bit about states. And I want to throw out two kind of different topics. You can pick up whatever you want from it. One of them is that not all states are created equal, right? A lot of the places where these projects are happening are in rural communities, or they're in red states like Texas or Oklahoma or Southern Illinois or West Virginia. And that is something where the sort of the cognoscenti on the coasts don't necessarily see it, understand it. They have a different value proposition. So there's a whole question about urban versus rural, the way that different states think about their own equities in this context, and that's something which is distinct. In addition to that, and perhaps reflecting that, different states have different policies. So you're seeing both New York and California go from a renewable portfolio standard to a clean energy portfolio standard, where something like CCS could potentially be an option. And in doing so, also increase ambition. They go from 50% to 100% or something like that. So if you can just comment a bit on how states are grappling with this technology and thinking it through, both from a futures perspective, how they see their citizens and how they see their economies evolving through this technology, as well as the policies that match them. Simple topic.
I want to bring up a state you did mention, which I think is doing a lot of really interesting stuff on this, which is Wyoming. I may have missed it in your list. As a West Virginia, I think Wyoming's kind of eating our lunch. I mean, they're doing an amazing job, and they think about that. I mean, it seems to me they seem like they're trying to transform their economy from this kind of coal, so they're the number one coal producer in the U.S. That's not what I meant by they're eating our lunch, but West Virginia is the second largest one. But I think their former governor would say, kind of, doesn't matter if you believe in climate change or not, that's the way the economy is going, and we need to act on that. Knowing that he was in a red state,
And they have invested really heavily in not just kind of carbon capture for coal, but looking at carbon capture for natural gas. They're also host to, there's the Carbon X Prize, which is an X Prize for CarbonTech. Half of the teams are at a test center in Wyoming. They've also involved, I mentioned earlier that I think federal policy has kind of had this project by project view and less of this kind of what infrastructure do we need to enable a really large scale deployment of carbon capture. And I think Wyoming is bringing in their infrastructure authority early on the conversation to talk about things like CO2 pipelines. So I think there are states like Wyoming that do see this future that is totally climate friendly, that is about, carbon tech, that is about, it's more carbon than coal-based, and are doing a lot of really interesting things.
So speaking of Wyoming, I don't know, you may have seen this, but there was a bill that that passed and the governor recently signed related to coal-fired power plants, which is if a coal-fired power plant is retiring and it's going up for sale, the owner has to put it up for sale out to the public, and so there is interest in carbon capture and storage associated with that, and that's a new policy that's just been acted by the state legislature, in Wyoming by the state legislature, and it's the state level policy is difficult to track, but there's a lot of interesting things like that happening.
So I have a couple of things to say. The first is that Illinois is by no means a red state, so I just like to correct that for the
Southern
books.
Illinois.
Yeah, regardless.
All right.
It's a very much a blue state, and but I see a few things happening or have happened in the past which are now starting to reoccur. So there's a question about pore space ownership, which has not been resolved, and that really is a state issue. We have seen examples during the Future Gen process in the sort of mid-2000s where the state of Texas and the state of Illinois passed bills to take liability for specific projects of stored CO2. We're seeing legislation move through the Indiana legislature right now, which could take liability or responsibility for CO2 from a specific project. So that sort of effort is happening at the state level. Another thing I'd like to say is I agree wholeheartedly that there's a lot of really good things happening in Wyoming. I'd also like to call forward states like North Dakota and Texas, who are very proactive in this space because they have significant fossil fuel infrastructure. They understand the mechanisms and how they're important to their state. North Dakota has led the effort to get state primacy for Class 6 and are the only state so far to have done so, although I think Wyoming has put in an application. But especially in North Dakota, they took a very proactive approach and said, look, we know our state, we know how things work, we want to be the ones who decide how carbon storage is going to go forward in our state, and we're happy at the state level to maintain that or to make the decisions. I think you will not see states like Illinois who seek primacy for Class 6, at least not anytime soon, and that has a lot to do with the status of the underground injection control program in those states, which is often just one individual responsible for an entire state. And so the regulatory deployment of that at the state level is, I think it's going to reside with the federal level for quite a while.
So there's one state you guys left out, and I'm going to pick on Erin a little bit about this. As a native
California.
California,
Well, I didn't know if I could jump in and say.
We have the
I
low
didn't
carbon
wanna-
fuel standard.
Yeah.
If you guys want to take a minute or two, just
Yeah.
really a minute or two,
That's
talk
fine.
about the low carbon fuel standard.
Okay, two things. One, get your state to build a natural gas carbon capture plan. But, yeah, the low carbon fuel standard is trading about $180 now. So Carbon Engineering just got a bunch of money. It's one of the kind of at the forefront of direct air capture companies. They're going to suck CO2 out of the air, turn it into a low carbon fuel, and they can use that $180 per ton right now. It's a it'll fluctuate, combined with the 45Q value, and potentially be kind of commercially viable with those policies. And so state policies like that from places like California that have really progressive, thoughtful climate policy that are thinking about direct air capture and carbon capture as part of the portfolio are really, really important.
Well, and we've also got apparently a new bill that's working its way through Hawaii looking at turning CO2 to products and CarbonTech. I got to give a shout out to Ian Philp from the Canadian Embassy. We did an event on this last night, and I see some of the people in the room from that event. But thinking about turning CO2 into products technologically is new, and the policies are starting to catch up with that. The state of New York recently passed, or the governor announced as part of his Green New Deal, a desire to have low carbon procurement standards for low carbon building materials made out of CO2.
Yeah, and I'll say that's something that's of interest of federal policymakers.
Right. I have 1,000 questions I'd like to ask, but I'm more interested in actually hearing from the people here. So let me first say again, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring around a microphone, and you can have a chance to talk about it. And again, for those of you watching online, you can use hashtag CGEP events, CGEP events, or our Twitter handle @ColumbiaUEnergy to ask a question.
I actually had 2 questions, but I can just wait for my second go around. Yeah. So the first one is, I think one of the speakers had talked about the price of the cost of doing this now, and he'd said that the DOE had the goal of reducing the cost. I think you said 50% over some time frame. But I don't think you attached numbers to what that cost was, or if you did, I missed them. So can you just go over what the costs are now and where you hope to get by what time frame?
Sure. So the costs now are somewhere around $60 a ton of CO2, and the goal is around $30 a ton of CO2.
Just for relevance, and I have to weigh in on this, apologies to the panel, but most people don't know what kind of incentives were already given for stuff we're already given. So they think about this just as a straight up cost, and they're like, well, why would we pay this extra money? For comparison, the wind production tax credit, typically $60 to $100 a ton. Some estimates say the wind production tax credit's $250 a ton. The EV subsidy in California, $1,000 a ton. And so when you think about it from a cost of the economy basis, $30 a ton, $60 a ton, that's already cheap compared to a lot of other things we support. And so the question is, why do you do it? What are you trying to support? What are the goals you want? I think those are fair questions for any policymaker in a public discussion, and certainly things that this panel has looked to and thought about. Do we have another question out there? So Julie's walking around, she's getting people, she sees all your hands, we'll get to you, I promise. Go ahead.
So just a technical question. What happens to the CO2 when you put it in the ground? What goes on? What is the capacity to store? For how many years of worldwide production can one store CO2 by the methods that you're talking about?
I so totally want to answer that question, but Sally actually should answer that question.
So there were actually several questions in there. So if I miss one of them, accept my apology, or my fellow panelists are also, we're all jumping at wanting to answer this question. So what happens with stored with CO2 once you store it in a rock formation is if you inject into a sandstone, you essentially have a structure where it's grains of sand that are cemented together to form a rock. If you think about that like a crate of oranges, those spheres touch each other in multiple places, but there's a lot of open space. That open space is what we call pore space, and it is typically filled with very, very salty brine. And so what happens when you inject carbon dioxide into a formation such as a sandstone is that CO2 will go, some of it will go into solution, and so it will dissolve into the CO2 or will be liquid dissolved into the water that's there. Some of it will be discrete carbon dioxide, and it is trapped in those pore spaces in perpetuity, essentially, is what your goal is. And so you look for packages of rocks where you have
something like a sandstone, which is porous and permeable, which can act as a sink or as a storage unit. And then overlying that, you look for an impermeable rock unit like a shale or a limestone, so that if CO2, which is less dense, more buoyant than the water that that's in place, if you start to have upward migration, you have an upward barrier. You have a barrier above so that it doesn't migrate upward.
So how much capacity compared, if you imagine doing this at scale, how much capacity is there compared to the worldwide need to store things?
Okay, so that's your last question. We'll get on to others, but go ahead. So Sarah or Sally?
Sarah. So the department has published a national atlas, and the U.S. is extremely rich in storage space for CO2, and in the scenarios that people are talking about for wide-scale deployment, yes, there is enough storage space.
Right. So the estimates that the Department of Energy's published and the USGS published range between 2.5 trillion tons and 30 trillion tons of capacity. So we emit 1.5 billion tons a year from the power sector today in the U.S. So that would be 1.8 billion versus trillions of tons of storage. And that's just the U.S. Global estimates are multiples of that. And you typically have it where you want it. You have it in China, you have it in India, you have it in the Middle East, you have it in the North Sea for Europe. Places which have heavy industrial economies and lots of coal are typically well situated close to places to store CO2.
Yes, it seems that there are several questions that are interrelated here, and I want to ask if they're being correlated. One of them, of course, is the social, the economic, and political aspects of there's new production that can be made with with carbon residues. Are these deposits of carbon, can they be revamped at one point to become harvested, to be sources for these industries that are emerging using carbon? And is this being correlated with a shift in regions that depend on coal to enable them to find a new industry to take over coal production, which they might be able to embrace? Because it's not just simply a question of, given the time factor, it's not simply a question of having these things, but also addressing the political and social and economic concerns of communities whose entire economy is based on coal, and having them embrace a shift.
So several questions there, thanks. And Julie, if you could come forward, there's a lot of people up here too. So who wants to take that?
So I think just to clarify, your first question was if you put it under the ground, can you pull it back up later for use? Okay. That I'm going to leave to one of the other panelists. But there are, as Julio mentioned, there are some overlaps where we think about places like Southern Illinois, where you have potential for coal, but you also have kind of heavy industry, where you might have steel or cement plants, where you can capture that CO2 and then use it to produce other goods, right? And I think right now the CarbonTech market, that carbon to value market, is relatively nascent. I think there are about 80 projects in the U.S., though I'll say that's higher than anywhere else. The U.S. has kind of got an edge on everybody else in this. But we do see that there's a lot of potential for overlap in places like, like what Wyoming's doing, or in places like Southern Illinois, or in historic extraction and coal communities where you do tend to see, you also see cement and steel and heavy industry. And so you could both use carbon capture on those, but use that CO2 that you capture to then produce. One of the biggest sectors for CarbonTech is in building materials and things like cement and concrete and aggregates.
So let me just add to that. One of the highest potential opportunities for the commoditization of carbon dioxide is in the enhanced oil recovery market. And so there's a lot of work to talk sort of about correlating where taking CO2 from places where you have a lot of point sources that are producing carbon dioxide and essentially shipping or pipeline, sending via pipeline CO2 from those sources to places where you're using carbon dioxide to enhance oil recovery, such as the Permian Basin in West Texas. So
by linking sources and potential places for use is where the continuation or the building of infrastructure can help the use market considerably. And in West Texas, the limiting step is the availability of CO2, and so to the degree that we can deliver CO2 to that region from places, and I will use Illinois as another example, or use it as an example again, then there's a direct market for that CO2 and a large amount. So basically they can take whatever CO2 we could deliver.
One last point to your question, sir. I look forward to the day when we are so scarce on CO2 in the atmosphere and so scarce on CO2 from point sources that we have to pull that stuff back out of the ground. I think that's off in the future for a while. Next, other questions here.
Forgive me, I came late, but is there a case study or example of a power plant or an individual situation that's utilizing carbon capture and doing it well right now and is able to store?
Yes. So we in the Department of Energy have had a number of projects at different scales. We had the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, which first started with characterizing regional sources and sinks, looking at what might make sense, then went through a series of field validation tests. I think there were, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think there were 20 projects in the initial stage, and then a handful that moved up to full scale. We also, we also have a program that's usually referred to as the Major Demonstration Program, and there are 3 of those demonstration projects that are operating right now. There's an industrial CCS project that's in Decatur, Illinois, which Sally talked about, that's taking CO2 from an Archer Daniels Midland ethanol production facility and storing it underground for long-term storage. There is the Petronova plant, which is taking CO2 from a coal-fired power plant, using it for enhanced oil recovery. And there is an Air Products project, which is taking CO2 at a refinery from steam methane reforming, which is another high-purity source, and using that for CO2.
I was just going to make a really quick plug for my old organization. At thirdway.org/carbon capture, you can see 2 things that are of interest. One is a map of carbon capture projects that's in the power and industrial sectors, carbon use, and carbon removal. But you can also watch a video by Julio talking about why carbon capture is really important for climate.
It's only 2.5 minutes, folks.
Yeah.
One more thing I want to throw out here. There's been a couple of times where this has been mentioned, and I want to just touch on it briefly. Heavy industry is hard to decarbonize. One of the things you can do is you can bring them low carbon heat. And so hydrogen has become a hot topic over the past couple of years as people are saying, well, maybe we can bring hydrogen in. And there's a discussion between what is increasingly called green hydrogen, meaning hydrogen from electrolysis of water using renewable power, or blue hydrogen, in which blue hydrogen is something like a steam methane reformer, where you're making hydrogen from natural gas, but you pair that with carbon capture, so you get these deep carbon reductions with the use of this hydrogen. There's this, and I mentioned this just briefly because this is actually some of the focus of our scholarship at the Center for Global Energy Policy, so watch this space. We're going to have stuff on this heading your way in the next few months. Sir?
Short question. Are there any global efforts to, using captured carbon with the Chinese?
Oh, that's
with the
definitely for Sarah.
Yeah, so you're asking if there are global CCS efforts?
Yeah, are you working with them?
Yes.
R&D and stuff?
So there are a number of, the department has a number of bilateral partnerships. Some of them have been going on for a long time. For example, there's a U.S.-Norway partnership. Also, under the auspices of the Clean Energy Ministerial, the IEA director and the Secretary of Energy have started a new track for CCS, and there's a CCUS, and there's an active dialogue and platform and lots of multilateral discussions that are happening. Speaking of the IEA, they have a CCS unit. They've published a couple of roadmaps on CCS and done things like looking globally at what countries are investing, what's happening. The U.S. is by far, our research program is among the oldest, and it's among the biggest, and we have a ton of experience in a tremendous program, but the research is not only in the United States. There are other countries that have research and development programs, other countries that do national atlases, that have demonstration projects. So it is certainly an effort that's an activity that's of global interest.
I want to just follow a cycle on that and turn it back to Sarah. There are 18 large-scale projects around the world, including 2 in the Middle East, 2 in the North Sea. So there's lots going on out there. But recently, the first came online from China. And I want to ask Sarah to talk about China and CCS, because that's a place we've been working for a long time, Sally too. But because China is such a huge emitter and such a huge user of coal, this question comes up a lot in the China context. If you'd speak on that briefly.
Sure. So I think Julio, I, and some others had the opportunity to work on U.S.-China collaboration on CCS when it was fairly new. Things in China tend to move very quickly, and there is a tremendous amount of research and development on the science side and also on the policy side. One of the things that I'll mention is there's an international standards organization effort that's been working on developing standards for carbon capture and storage. China actually was Canada was the chair for that effort, and China was the mirror chair. And that effort, the standards for CO2 storage and enhanced oil recovery were just published within the last couple of months. So there's so much happening on China, it's hard to start. Those are the things that come to mind quickly, and I'll turn it to Sally.
I wasn't really going to speak about China. I just wanted to mention that some of the leaders in this space are certainly Norway, that has 2 projects, and there are some of the really seminal early work that was happening in Norway. Australia is very engaged in this space. Japan, our European colleagues, and even South Africa and some other countries that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be in this space have been heavily Saudi Arabia. UAE, yeah, exactly. And so, to your point about whether or not we talk to each other and we share experiences, there's many venues through which that happens. The bilateral, Sarah was talking about international conferences, and there's a conference that happens every 2 years called the Greenhouse Gas Technology Conference. It was just hosted in Melbourne last October, and that's really the big venue for all of us to come and share space, or share knowledge and share experiences.
Right. So for those of you out here who are SEPA people, the international policy arena is hopping in this space. Yes.
So my question is regarding scalability. Like we are hearing 1 million tons a year, and you said like 1 billion tons of emissions a year. So how we go from 1 million tons in 18 projects to billions of tons, where probably carbon storage is one of the few technologies that will bring negative emissions. And I think that's like one of the things that I always have in my head when I think about carbon storage, like the scalability, like how to actually scale this to that technology that actually matters on climate policy.
Excellent question, and one everyone here is ready to talk about. Who wants to start? Scalability?
Yeah, so one thing that there's a lot of depth to that question, but one thing that I should mention is, so I've talked a little bit about some of the department's efforts on the regional carbon sequestration partnerships, and I mentioned how those projects started with field validation tests and they're scaling up. Well, a research effort that we have underway right now is a program called Carbon Safe, and that effort is looking at big scale, real world, commercial scale projects. And one of the interesting things to tie the discussion back in is, as those projects have been looking at and thinking about a big scale project in their state or their region, the regulators and the policymakers in those states have also started to ask questions about what it takes to get to scale. In my remarks, I talked about technical hurdles. I talked about the regulatory landscape. The financial hurdle was really one of the linchpins to getting CCS to the type of scale that we're talking about. We have to have a willingness to invest in it and a willingness to do it as much as anything else.
Yeah, I'd say totally agree. I think financing, so that combination of bringing down the costs, and to Julio's point where, he explains that the problem isn't necessarily that this technology is too expensive, it's that you can't finance it, not to quote you back to yourself, but, questions about policies like 45Q. We're also working on things like private activity bonds and master limited partnerships. Doesn't matter what those are for this conversation, just that they help you finance a project. I think the infrastructure question, right? A lot of these projects are happening in places where you already have CO2 pipelines because of enhanced oil recovery, but we need them in lots of places, and we need to think about how we build those CO2 pipelines. I think, again, to the permitting question, across the board, certainty on permitting and the regulatory questions are really important. I think state policies can play a huge role, right? The low carbon fuel standard in California, clean energy standards across the U.S., all of those things are really, really important. And I think I think a lot of those things are the case for both carbon capture and things like direct air capture. On carbon use, I think, CarbonTech, that can be another lever to help kind of finance these projects. And I think one of the things that can be really important in scaling this industry where we're already seeing these first movers is to implement federal and state procurement policies where a lot of these companies are ready to scale up now. It's just a question of finding customers. And so I think it's really like a lot of overlapping policies that are really durable and that have that kind of vision of scale.
Just one last thought on this. This question was the same question that was asked of solar and LEDs 10 years ago. They were too expensive, there was no way to scale them up, there wasn't the transmission infrastructure, all this other stuff. And a whole bunch of policies made the financing possible for that. The feed-in tariffs of the Energiewende, renewable portfolio standards and stuff. I'm glad that we're asking those same questions 10 years later because now we have a recipe. We actually know how to do the scaling and what's required to bring that private financing into the public sphere. Next.
Yeah, I'm curious. Apparently in Iceland they use the steam from geothermal wells combined with the carbon dioxide to make methanol, and then they ship it to the Netherlands where they use it instead of ethanol as a fuel additive. We have geothermal wells. We've got lots of CO2. Why don't we do that here?
I mean, lots of reasons. Probably, I think we will, right? I mean, these are early movers. You're talking about a direct air capture project, Climeworks.
No, he's talking about the Carbon Recycling International, the CRI project.
You're right. Sorry. Yes.
I would not suggest anything as direct air capture.
Oh, I would, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, now I have a different response. I mean, there are lots of reasons, right? Hopefully, it might be better.
Yeah, so I try not to answer for the panel, but I fail. So the one thing I'd say is that project is entirely financed by the clean diesel standard in a handful of Scandinavian countries. And they are prepared to pay above market rates for the methanol they use to fuel cell those ferries. And that's what makes that project economic. So back to Aaron's point, if we had a procurement standard in the United States where we said, hey, like we're prepared to pay additional money to get a super clean fuel to run some set of stuff, whether it's federal planes, like in the military, or whether it's, some set of port operating authorities, the city of New York, for example, if they decided that they were going to move to that kind of fuel, then you could start financing projects like that. The problem is always, how do you get customers to finance the project? How do you get the loan from the bank? And the Scandinavian policies around clean fuels is what made the CRI project commercial.
Yeah, so I think, like with a lot of these things, they're totally possible in the U.S. It's what combination of policies are you going to get?
Mm-hmm. And the clean air, the low carbon fuel standard in California is starting to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I was a bit late too, so I apologize. But I'm wondering, you're sort of in a fairly wide silo in terms of ways of approaching carbon capture and use, but there's a historical biological standards, right, in terms of do you feel there's a looming threat in the sense of your silo from like a biomimicry version, like let's grow lots and lots of trees but then make them into stuff that's as tough as steel. Recently there's been research in the New Scientist where they took out lignin or something and it ends up being a great building material. So along the lines of what you said, I just wondered if there's any sort of collaborations across that people are thinking about, because I suspect the cost of carbon in a would, if you could then use it, might even be a magnitude less, right? $3 a ton or something.
Well, I hadn't seen that paper, but I will say that, at least within the Department of Energy, we do talk to our colleagues in the Bioenergy Technologies Office, and we have some active discussions about things like, bioenergy with CCS, but now I'm going to ask them about this, so thank you.
Right, I've been trying to track the space, and I'll be super brief. We only have time for really one more question here before we're going to start wrapping up. But right now, what I see is actually not that so much. Mostly what I see is schism. And we have this incredibly urgent climate challenge, and yet the tree people are saying trees are better, and the rock people are saying rocks are better. Like, we kind of need to move beyond that because we need so much more. I have my own, I have my own love for biopathways and biomimetic pathways. I don't see how they get the fluxes or the volumes, but we just need more of all this stuff. And I want to see a lot more innovation, a lot more effort on all of it. And again, that's why I'm at a policy shop instead of a technology shop.
Yeah, and I'll say we work on all of that stuff at Carbon 180. I've been talking about the tech side because that's what we've been talking about, but we work on land and ag pathways as well.
Okay, so two more questions then.
The question a moment ago was about scale. And I'm just struck by the, so to speak, the lack of creativity in the financial space. Today, Lyft is in the process of raising money. And it's an organization that's losing $1 billion a year. And it's able, now, I would argue that what we're talking about here today is incredibly important. I mean, it's the future of the planet. It's one of the biggest things there is. And goddamn it, why can't the finance community really get as creative as they are about, a rideshare program?
I don't have a good answer for that. But, one thing I do want to say, though, is I think I talked about, Julio asked the question about how you get bills passed, and I talked about all the people who are kind of engaged in this advocacy, and it's a really diverse set of groups. I think finance has been missing a little bit from that, not entirely, but I think that's a policy gap that we definitely see, and I think we've been trying to make inroads there, and some have been more successful than others, but I think that's something we think a lot about.
I also think that we're starting to see that change. I think you're starting to see more finance people at the table. I don't presume to speak for the Department of Energy, but I know that they have engaged considerably with Asia Development Bank and the World Bank and are very active in that space.
So I mentioned a little while ago the Clean Energy Ministerial and the CCUS engaging the financing community and getting at that angle is a major priority for that effort.
So last question in the back here.
Thank you very much for an excellent panel discussion. We certainly have enough oil, petroleum products, and natural gas pipelines in the United States as well as globally. So my question is more for the DOE purposes. Has there been any correlation, let's say, between formations of shale and formations that are adaptable for CCS?
Sure. So I think there has not been a correlation. One of the challenges is the way that we're producing shale gas. We're fracturing what could be a cap rock. So when you do citing a CCS project requires site-specific geological characterization to ensure that you have the type of rock that Sally described and that you're going to inject the CO2 in such in a secure formation. So in general, but there has been some research, and there are formations where you can do stacked storage, where you can enhance oil recovery in a formation, and then in an underlying or overlying formation, CO2 storage is possible. So we are looking at geology holistically, but at the surface, I think we always have to be careful to make sure that we're selecting sites that have the properties required for secure CCS.
So if I could just add to that,
there's an inherent difference, as Sarah pointed out, in the process that you're using to produce shale gas and the process that you're using to store carbon dioxide. And the major difference is that you are regulated by law when you're doing carbon dioxide storage or enhanced oil recovery, that you are not fracturing the rock, and that is the major difference when you are producing shale gas. So those two things are in a bit direct conflict with each other.
So I could do this all night, and I plan to keep doing this later, but before I turn to the panelists, I'm going to ask each of them to make a 1-minute kind of statement, anything that you left on the table or something you want to make sure we get that's relevant to this discussion. While you're formulating that, please just let me say thank you again, everyone, for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, the full video of this recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. We hope you take a look at it. Also, this is only one of a number of events that the Center for Global Energy Policy is hosting in the coming weeks. Our next event in New York City is President Carter's Energy, Economic, and Foreign Policy. And it's a book conversation with Stuart Eisenstadt, who was a former chief domestic policy advisor to President Carter, moderated by Jason Bordoff, and also with Stefan Stestanovich, who's professor of practice of international diplomacy at Columbia University. After that, we also have a fireside chat with Jack Lew, former Secretary of the Treasury. That's going to be at the Low Library faculty room on April 1st with Jack Lew and Richard Nephew, who's a senior research scholar at the center. I also want to give a quick shout out to Julie Marino. Julie runs our Women in Energy program at the Center for Global Energy Policy and has put on this event as well as dozens of other fantastic events just like it. So thank you, Julie. With that, I want to turn to the panelists and give you each one last moment here to lay out some truth we all need to hear.
I'd like to close by saying that from my perspective, we hear a lot of talk about barriers, and from my perspective, there are no barriers when it comes to carbon capture, utilization, and storage, but there remain some challenges. And at this point in time, I believe we have addressed many of the technical challenges, and that although storage will always be very geology specific, and requires individualized activities at a particular site, we're starting to see policy drivers, but we need more policy, we need more business involvement, we need the financial community, we need the insurance communities, and so we need to take the conversation from the practitioner space in which I operate into the public space in which we can have these types of dialogue.
My closing remarks are just seconding all of that, I think, in a far less eloquent way, but I think we're ready to go, right? A lot of the technology questions totally agree that we've answered, and that all of the problems we face are totally solvable. But, we need to be a little more interdisciplinary or build on some of the pieces of the interdisciplinary work that we've done. I think we need to learn from other successes. We were talking about the technology angle of learning from things like wind and solar, but I think there are other lessons we can learn from them, and that there's this enormous opportunity, and I think we can't think big enough about the opportunity that these technologies provide, and we need to bring in people that aren't just the typical energy actors, right? This is not about just one sector. It's about the finance community, but it's also about community engagement. It's about bringing in labor unions, and I think it's ready to kind of take off.
Sarah, last word.
CCS is essential to reducing CO2 emissions, meeting climate goals. It has been a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for your attention. And I just want to close by saying this is only the second time I've been on a panel that's an all-women panel, and it's been a true pleasure to be. Thank you.
This is not my first time, and I certainly hope not my last time to be doing this, but please join me in thanking this extraordinary set of panelists, Dr. Sally Greenberg, Aaron Burns, and Sarah Forbes.